back. You are watching our non-stop coverage of the Union Budget. They say it's a budget for everybody, but to actually go through it, we are joined by Subrakant Panda, the President of the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry. Thanks very much, Mr. Panda, for being with us. Are you satisfied with what the budget says about employment? Labour force participation rates have been low. Has enough been done to address that concern?
Well, in as much as the budget is concerned, yes, satisfied, because I think the single most important point which we at FICCI and I think everybody else had raised going into the presentation of the budget was that it needs to have a growth orientation. And I think that is what has happened with the largest ever outlay for capital expenditure at 10 lakh crores. And if you take into account the granted aid to states, then that goes up to about 13.7 lakh crores, which is 4.5% of GDP. So I think, and the good thing about this is that when you talk about capex, it has a multiplier effect, and it has a effect cutting across various sectors, and that is certainly going to be positive for employment. Not to mention, there are several other initiatives that the government has taken up, which all look at it from an employment perspective, which is, for example, the PLI schemes. So it's not just the announcement in the budget per se that one needs to look at, because governance is 365 days a year. So there are other steps which have been taken for employment generation, which I believe will bear fruit. But I mean, obviously, one has to give it some time for all these initiatives to have impact on the ground. In as much as female labor participation is concerned, certainly that is something that needs to be stepped up. In that context, in fact, FICCI has done some work in terms of putting together an ideation exercise on what could be done, and I think there are some steps going ahead which will work towards boosting female labor participation.
If you look at debt as a percentage of GDP, in 2015 it was 66.6%. That's now risen to 87.6%. And India clearly has high interest rates compared to many countries, for example, the United States. In other words, debt repayment, our debt burden, as it were, is that much more difficult, and it's something which has to be factored into the budget, obviously. So India's debt as a percentage of GDP and the fact that it's risen, again, how should we look at that?
So look, there are two ways to look at it. It is a fact that India's debt to GDP ratio has gone up, but keep in mind that has gone up during the pandemic period, where there was absolutely a clamor for support from the government in order to tide over that very challenging period. And I must commend the government for the heavy lifting that they have done in during the pandemic and its immediate aftermath, and that of course continues in this budget with the allocation for capex, as we just talked about. But the other way of looking at it is, if you look at FY 21 or 22, compared to that, there is some consolidation taking place, and India's debt to GDP ratio has actually come down from a peak of about 90+%. And again, if you compare to countries like the United States or China, where those numbers are sky high, I think we are in a much better position. And finally, on one more data point, that if you add corporate indebtedness to this, which is in the mid 50s, if I'm not mistaken, then overall I think it's a good situation. And keep in mind that during the last couple of years, the traditionally cyclical sectors have deleveraged significantly, and that is something that bodes well for us going ahead, given the possibilities of some unpleasant surprises if they were to unfortunately come about.
All right, Mr. Panda, thanks very much for speaking to us. Subrakant Panda, the President of FICCI, thanks very much indeed. We're joined by Monica Hallan, Sanjeev Parikh and Rajiv Gowda joins us as well. Mr. Gowda, let me come to you first. Rahul Gandhi has tweeted, he says, Mitra Kal budget has no vision to create jobs, no plan to tackle mehengai, no intent to stem inequality. But, we were just speaking to the president of FICCI over there, who says that the capex spend is something which would create jobs. There is a multiplier effect.
Well, Vishnu, the basic job of a government is to take care of those who are falling behind. There are other jobs, including investing for the future, but especially in a country where you have 80 crore people dependent on free food, you absolutely have to do something to create opportunities for them. And what do we see? We do not need indirect trickle-down agendas. We need direct initiatives that actually go out there and provide succor at a time like this. And we don't see any attention. In fact, we see the reverse. We see Manrega, which is one of the most successful social safety nets that we've had. We've seen a cut in that. We don't see investment. You want investment? What about investment in our people, in their health, in their education? Have you seen an increase in those numbers? Has there been an increase in the amount for women and children? 1%? Is that sufficient? So it is not just capital expenditure that is into physical assets. That, of course, has its benefits. But we need to invest in human capital and in ensuring that we don't have this sorry statistic of 1/3 of our children being, underweight, wasted and stunted with their future compromised as a result of our callousness or this government's callousness.
Monica,
so that's really the challenge.
Yeah. Monica, I mean, it is true that, in terms of the outlay to education or health, it's not found pride of place at all in this budget. I remember in the case of health, there are training centers which are being co-located along with medical schools. But is this a glaring omission, health and education, social sector spending?
Vishnu, when you think about social sector spending, look, health and education finally are state subjects. And this, it sort of segues into a very important point for me. So we've all been talking of the great capex push that the center does, and it's fantastic, 3.3% of GDP. But finally, the projects are implemented in the states. And if you look at the website of the central government, which tracks some of these large infrastructure projects, you see that 33% are behind on their time schedule by 2 to 3 years, and there is a cost escalation of between 20 to 40%. Now, the issue is that there is a scrutiny on the center, but I don't think we're doing the same scrutiny on what the states are doing to take this agenda forward.
Sure.
So I think we need a little bit more observation as to how the schemes are actually implemented in the states. Maybe it's time for a state's report card, which we look at month on month to see which state is lagging behind, why, and why do we have these cost and time overruns on projects which are so important for all of us. So just one short point, that I don't want to get into the politics of this budget and metrics like stunting, but this is a budget, in my opinion, which is targeting more growth. And both Vishnu, you and I have been part of this generation who benefited from the 1991 economic reforms. It was a giant wave which lifted all the boats.
Yeah.
We could not have imagined an India of, in the 70s and 80s that we saw post 2000.
No, absolutely.
A similar push is happening right now. And I don't think the millennials and the Gen Zs are looking for so much, let's say, freebies or reverie culture. They're looking for empowerment and they're looking for growth. So I think the budget, in my opinion, is ticking a lot of those boxes.
Sure. Sanjeev Parikh, one of the areas which we should talk about, private sector investment. A lot of the growth that we are seeing in our economy now, is it being almost entirely bankrolled by the government? Are we seeing the private sector investing? Why has this been declining, in fact? I think you're on mute. Can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, thanks. So I think it's been a good jugalbandi for the past few years in terms of, the government pushing for infrastructure, and effectively, the infrastructure projects are being run by the private sector, whether it's road building, whether it's ports. So I think we're seeing a lot of efficiency which is coming into infrastructure. Yes, there have been delays, as Monica mentioned, but I think the main point here is what Monica said, which is a rising tide raises all boats, and we've been seeing that consistently since 1991. So I think that the first thing is, I think the push for infrastructure helps the long-term raising of this tide. Number two, I think the entire, the tax benefits which have come, the rising slabs, etc., will put more cash in the hands of people. So it's really going to help the middle class. And finally, I think the whole emphasis on governance and using technology for improved governance, reducing kind of compliance burdens, will also help with, the softer side of the growth. And of course, I think at some point, of course, I think we will need to move away from this, what Monica called the reverie culture. I think the growth itself, we need to empower people. We need to create the right framework for the jobs and not kind of throw money at people and hope that they'll feed themselves.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank you all very much for joining us.